So one of the greatest frustrations and opportunities that teachers have are in assessing the work of their students. Now, assessment is really important because it helps us measure student learning and it helps us identify areas where students might be weak and where we might improve as a teacher. So for today's lesson, we're going to go over different kinds of assessment, things that we can do to improve assessment, and just some general things to be aware of when it comes to testing. All right. So first, let's look at a definition here for assessment. Google calls it the evaluation or estimation of the nature, quality, and ability of someone or something. So it's just us estimating how well somebody can do something. Now, in schools, obviously we assess students' memory, what they can retain in different content areas. Often we assess their ability to apply that knowledge to more practical means. But we also sometimes measure things like citizenship and student behavior. We might measure leadership ability and involvement of students. Even in a classroom economy, we might measure students' contributions to the classroom environment. And so we're measuring lots of little things, but what parents and students most often think of when we talk about assessment is grades, right? What did they do to get the grade that they want, which is usually an A, and how are we measuring their progress? So, sorry, I should have flipped this up earlier. So this is just a different definition, the ongoing process of gathering evidence of what a student actually knows, understands, and do. And of course, that's what we want to measure. All right, so this is a poll that I do with my students face-to-face, but I want to do it with you just because I think this is a useful exercise. You're going to think about your own experience as a student. So if you're a student now, great. If you were a student once, think about that time. And many of the assessments that we give use these kinds of assessment questions: multiple choice, true, false, essay, fill in the blank, short answer. And then there's a bunch of other ways of assessments, and we'll talk about some alternative assessments here in a few minutes. But I want you to think, when you were a student and you could pick one of these assessment options, what did you like the most? You would probably be in the majority if your answer is multiple choice. It seems like most students favor multiple choice. However, I always have a handful of students who prefer essay, and that seems to be the two polar extremes, where we have a lot of students who really love multiple choice and a few that really love essay, and then occasionally there'll be someone that likes these other choices but not so much. Now, the reason I ask you this question is now I want to think about, why did you like multiple choice? And when I ask my students this, usually the answers have nothing to do with student learning. So students like multiple choice because it's easy, because they can game the system, because there are strategies in place that they understand, because there's at least a 25% chance that they're going to get it right, even if they have no idea what the question is about. And so a lot of students like multiple choice for that reason. Students who claim to like essay the most often will have answers that involve student learning, but it's because it gives them more opportunities to explain, to talk around what they understand. So it doesn't have to be perfect, like multiple choice, and most of these, you either get it right or wrong. But essay is a little bit more subjective, where you can explain your reasoning, and some students really, really like that. Now, I want you to think about yourself as a teacher, or the teachers that you've had. What of these options do you think your teachers liked the most? Multiple choice, true, false, essay, fill in the blank, shorter answer. Now, I've also asked teachers that I've worked with and student teachers, what do they prefer? And this may or may not surprise you, but most of them also report multiple choice. And again, not because it measures student learning, but because it's the easiest one to implement. It can be automatically graded, or you can have someone else grade it for you. It measures learning a little bit, but it's not too hard, and they like that their students are having success. And so it's interesting that many, many teachers prefer multiple choice also for those reasons. Some teachers prefer essay, and again, this is a similar reason. it helps them to really understand what their students understand and to look at the nuances. Now, the truth is, we can utilize all these and we can make really good multiple choice questions. We can make really good true-false questions. We can make really good essay questions. But we have to consider how long will it take to create that curriculum, to create those assessments? How long will it take to grade those assessments? So those are factors that matter to teachers because we don't have an infinite number of hours in the day, and so we have to work with what we've got. All right, now before we can think about which of these questions we should be utilizing, we have to think about the best way of coming up with an assessment, and we're going to utilize backwards design for that. Now, backwards design we've already talked about because this is a great way to construct any curriculum, but it certainly ties into what we'll talk about today with assessment. The idea here with backwards design is that we first look at the results. We begin with the end in mind, and we look at what do we want our students to learn. So that often involves looking at your Utah State standards, creating learning objectives. So that's what we're looking at first, and that kind of focuses on these ideas and skills. Then we decide how do we measure if our students have those results, right? So what is the assessment task that will measure whether or not our students have learned something, hopefully mapped to our state standards. And then, and usually teachers do this backwards, they come up with what would be great activities, but if we've come up with our goals first and then our assessments, then we can decide what's our best use of classroom time. What are the instructional strategies and learning activities that we should use in the classroom so that we can then have some kind of assessment that will measure learning. All right, so we want to utilize backwards design wherever possible, but again, this can be a time-consuming process. So the question I ask you is, if we truly use backwards design, is it a good idea or a bad idea to teach to the test? Now, the reason I ask you this question is, if the test is mapped to the state standards and the learning objectives, wouldn't that be our goal, is to make sure that our students understand? And so in a perfect world, wouldn't all teachers teach to the test? I think often this gets a bad rap because we have a lot of test anxiety. Tests aren't used very effectively. Maybe people aren't using backwards design to develop tests. But if we made better tests, then the reasons for teaching to the test would be greater. So, and I'm certainly not advocating we teach to the test because there's a lot more to the classroom than simply meeting even those learning objectives, right? There's a lot of things that don't show up on our state standards. But if we developed our test this way, we should be teaching towards that more often. All right, now there's two kinds of assessments that we're going to talk about today. Formative and summative. Formative helps our students learn and practice. So these are things that we do in class. For example, I might just ask a question as a teacher and have students raise their hand. That would be a formative assessment. It gives me information right then, and it helps students to think through and talk about ideas. I think pair share might be another formative assessment, or maybe a reflection or an exit ticket could be a formative assessment. This happens throughout the course. It helps us identify gaps in learning, and it helps us to identify specific students' needs. Now, a summative assessment comes after learning has taken place. So we think of traditional quizzes and tests here. It usually takes place at the end of the instructional period, whether that be the end of the class period or the end of the unit or the end of the year. It looks at everything that they've learned up to that point, and yeah, that's what a summative assessment is. So our high stakes assessments, those are summative assessments. So why do we have summative? Obviously, if we care about student learning, identifying gaps and improving learning, formative assessment handles that, right? So why do we need these summative assessments? And why do we need high stakes and standardized tests at the end of the year, high stakes assessments? So I want you to think about that. Well, we measure student learning by doing both formative and summative assessments. How do we measure the effectiveness of a teacher or of a school, right? We have to have some way to measure that, and we can do that observationally, and certainly that's part of the formula. We can do that by self-report. Teachers can talk about how well they're doing or how well they think their students are doing. But summative assessments give us some concrete data that help us measure the effectiveness of a teacher, of a school, of a district, And so that's part of the reason we have standardized tests. This is also an opportunity for students to look at their growth over time. Are they improving on these standardized tests year over year? Is their basic knowledge and understanding of these concepts becoming stronger? So there are a number of reasons we have standardized tests. We'll talk more about this in the future, but just wanted to overview it for you here. Now, there are also alternative assessments. So I want you to think, aside from some of the things I've already mentioned, what are other ways that teachers have measured your learning or your progress in the classroom? I'm going to put up a brief list of things from a reading that I gave my students. So we've got observation, essays, interviews, having students actually do something, whether that be a demonstration or a performance, having journaling, teacher-created tests, which would still typically be either a summative assessment or some kind of traditional assessment, rubrics, and self and peer evaluation. Now, my second question here is, what were your experiences with these kinds of assessments? When I asked my face-to-face students about that, the results are all over the map. Some of my students swear by this, that alternative assessments are awesome and incredible and really do a great job at measuring student learning. Others have had horrible experiences with those. So similar to just your normal formative and summative assessments, when we look at alternative assessments, a lot of it boils down to, are we utilizing backwards design here? Are these things mapped to learning objectives? Have we created an assessment that truly measures what our students have learned? And chances are we all have a little bit of room for improvement in this area. All right, so now I want to give you a self-assessment. This is something that I do with my students, and I just wanted you to show this slide to show kind of an alternative assessment. This is a peer or a self-evaluation that I give, and this is actually really helpful for me. I use this as a formative assessment just to get a sense of where students feel they're at. But I also do this to help encourage students to do a little bit more. So in this self-assessment, I ask my students to simply give themselves a grade. So at this point in the semester, or at this point in this video sequence that I'm creating for you, how do you feel you're doing? What's the effort that you've put into this? So if we're talking about a growth mindset, do you feel like you've put forth enough effort that you're gaining something significant by watching these videos or by learning in this class? When you look at all the assignments that you're doing, whether that's reading the articles, watching videos, doing the different big course assignments, and participating in class, how do you feel your effort is? How does that stack up? And I don't necessarily want my students to compare themselves to others, but they have a sense of what a good effort is. And so what grade would you give yourself? What could you do to improve? And then I actually have my students post that, and as part of their exit ticket, they do a reflection at the end of class. And it's mostly, obviously I'm not grading it on what their answers are, but I'm grading it on whether or not they completed this. And the hope is that it helps them think about, what am I putting into this class and what am I getting out of it? So just a couple things before we wrap up. This comes up every time I talk to my students about testing. It's a major issue. What about test anxiety? What can we do to help our students? If tests or assessments can be really positive, how can we make them more positive in our classrooms? And so this comes up often, and I'll address this in some of my student responses. I have some video shorts that I'll post in this playlist. But test anxiety, I think, exists because of pressures that other people put on our students. Often that's pressures their parents put on. You need to be a straight A student, and whether that's to get a reward, I'll give you $100 for every A, or to avoid a punishment. If you get Fs, then you need to do whatever horrible chore at the home, or you can't have screen time or whatever. So a lot of, especially younger students, are influenced by their parents. Now there's also pressure put on by their classmates, by teachers, by other people that they care about in their lives, because typically good test results lead to good grades, which lead to going on to college and getting a better job, etc. So there's a lot of social pressure associated with testing. But I think another problem that we have here is we put so much weight on these summative assessments that we're not taking advantage of the formative assessments. Instead of having one test worth 50% of your grade, why not have 5 tests worth 10% each? That's going to reduce the anxiety, right? Or better yet, why not have a quiz every class period that's worth like 0.5%? And those things will add up to give you a grade. Maybe you're graded on your progress over time, or your understanding and how that deepens. And so we have to think about our assessments a little different. We can also reduce anxiety by talking about test taking strategies, talking about how to do multiple choice questions or true and false, what to do as far as sleeping the night before a big test and having a good breakfast the day of, things like that. We can talk about how we care about our students regardless of how they do on their test. And sometimes simply feeling like someone has your back helps you with anxiety, feeling that you're loved and supported. So there's a lot that we can do as teachers, and I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list now, but I just want you to be thinking about that. And this is from a Business Insider, some things that I didn't mention. Study over time, don't cram, take practice tests, get tested for a learning disability so that you can have some kind of accommodation, and then take advantage of relaxation techniques. So these are some things that teachers can do. All right. Well, that should be enough to kind of just give you a brief overview of assessment. We're going to talk about how to do assessment better, and we're going to talk about this culture around assessment moving forward, and how we can change kind of some of these negative stereotypes and negative feelings that many of our students have about assessment, so that'll be coming up in a future video. I would love to know what questions you have regarding assessment from this video, or that's just looming in your mind, so make sure you drop those in the comments, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.